What are the benefits of nationalisation versus privatisation?
Hello and welcome to the Mark and Pete Show. Yes, the UK political parties are setting out their ideas for the country. And in fact, privatisation or nationalisation is a big issue. If we take, for example, the Labour Party, and some say, I wish that you could, well, in fact, they seem to be on the favour of nationalising certain institutes, such as the utilities. In fact, in complete contrast, the Conservatives have criticised the Labour's plans to nationalise areas such as the BT service, particularly with regards to offering free broadband. Now, I would say that this goes even further. Many people think that actually it's time now that the nationalisation programme kicks in, simply because of crumbling infrastructure and poor services. Well, here's just a little thought to reinforce that idea. Utility, futility. Jack and Jill received a bill for gas and the water. Jack held his crown. Jill came tumbling down, and the debts grew every quarter. Yes, Clergyman Pete, it seems like debts are rising and we've got crumbling infrastructure and neglected services. Is it now time that we had nationalisation as part of our programme?
Well, my answer to this is rather nuanced. Is it a good idea? Well, it's a good idea to have nationalisation if you're thinking of it in terms of it being coordinated by the government. So what I'm talking about may not be always called nationalisation. When you talk about nationalisation, you talk about it being owned, whatever it is, be it the post office or the railways or water or other utilities, are owned by the state. Whereas what I'm talking about is not strictly privatisation in which private companies take it over, but rather a sort of nuanced middle ground in which the government is responsible for ensuring that certain industries and certain infrastructure and certain resources are supplied, so that's their responsibility. But the way that it's delivered can be far more inventive, creative, and entrepreneurial.
Well, I think we have to sort of understand how we've got to where we are.
Sure.
Under the Prime Minister leadership of Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s, at least 22 big privatisations took place. Now, that included BT, British Telecom, and British Airways, along with the water and the sewage services and many other things. Now, many people thought that this was a great idea in the sense that with the idea of bringing in privatisation, companies who could bid for contracts, that this would increase standards and improve services. At the same time, people had the opportunity to invest in those institutes. And no doubt that people have certainly profited from that. But on the counter to that, and particularly the Labour Party's view at this moment in time, is that certain services have been neglected. If we take, say, for example, the water services, not only have bills been going up, but many people have been fined because they've either had water leakages, maybe pollution has been another issue, and perhaps that some people feel that the investment hasn't been there. So maybe what we're thinking about here, Clergyman Pete, let me see whether you agree with this. I believe that there are certain areas where it's a bit of a hybrid approach.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say necessarily that privatisation should be a one-fits-all. Similarly, again, that nationalisation shouldn't be a one-fits-all. So I'm going to pick out the ones which I think should be nationalised, and I think the ones that should be kept as being private.
That might be a good way to go. So if you do that, I will probably have some comments to make because, as I outlined at the start, I've got a specific it's way of thinking rather than, as you say, a one-fits-all policy. That
Yes.
Well, we'll see how that applies to what you say.
Yes. Well, I'm going to start with the privatisation because if we take, say, for example, the potential possibility of nationalising, say, our technological infrastructure, and particularly BT.
Yes.
Whilst many people have got some issues with BT on their service, notorious for being difficult to get hold of and poor response, but also the fact that certain communities don't have broadband, and certainly Infinity, where essentially they have the best broadband services. And that has been an issue. But what I would say is, and this is where I think the competition is really crucial, innovation in a technological field, in my opinion, doesn't sit well within a nationalised government. Governments, perhaps in some cases, particularly when it comes to technology, don't always standardise on the best thing, don't always understand it. And that's where I believe that actually, when it comes to something like telecommunications, I would say that it needs to be really given to the specialists, those who actually know what they're doing. Now, it may not necessarily be BT. So I think this is the clear distinction, that if, for example, BT fail on services, and let's say, folks, maybe they have, and I'm sure that many of our listeners are screaming, yes, I'm one of them, I'm getting a poor service. Maybe that's the case where, in actual fact, the contracts should be slightly shorter and a little bit more rigorous in their tenders. And I think that that's where I think that customers throughout the United Kingdom would certainly benefit. However, we then look at perhaps some of the nationalisation ideas. Now, this is where I think it comes to what I would call the essential services. And I think water, gas and electricity is one where really in a civilized society, we don't want bills rising. We know that there's been some issues with certain service providers because either the shareholders have been paid too much, executives have been paid too much, and not enough investment is put into infrastructure. For me, that is where I believe that certain policy changes should have to take place, because unfortunately, I don't believe that those services are adding the right value, and it's becoming worrying that we could be in a situation where actually, when you think about how we invest in, say, for example, nuclear or hydropower or wind power, etc. Sure. Governments are better placed at this moment in time maybe to nationalise. So that's where I would say it. Now, the one which is the big debate is the railway service. Now, at one time, folks, yes, British Rail, as it once was, was known as an inept service.
True.
Badly serviced. Infrastructure was terrible. What happened was, in the privatisation, we had the breakup. We had the signalling, we had the operators, that's the train service, and then we had the track service. Now, many people thought it was a great way to privatise those, and in some ways there was a little bit of a boost in service. Sadly, and I have experienced this myself, the service is now completely inept. Not only does the service not run on time, the conditions are poor, new railway services that are promised, and been promised by a lot of the contractors who are actually operating the service lines, simply fail to bring in the new trains on time. And worryingly, we've had countless strikes, which is basically grinding the service to a halt. So that's what I'm going to park for later. But Clergyman Pete, what's your thoughts on the utilities and what's your thoughts on the telecom situation?
Well, this is where I like your analysis. I do agree that there were certain things that should be supplied by government. The priorities of government in an ideal world would be set by the people. So priorities, what do we need? The government looks at that, and this is how we're going to supply it. And if that's done best by a government-owned supplier, then we can argue that it's better if it is done by the government. However, what I would say is this: whilst for most things, the quality of the service goes down over time if it's owned by the government. Now, we could look at, there are lots of different strategies you could put into place to try and stop that happening. But in practice, this has never been done. And whenever we have a complete nationalised, I guess you could call it, monopoly of a particular industry, we find, well, I said industry, it's not always industry, or supply of a particular resource, then the quality tends to go down. Now, so that would mean then, I would be thinking of, what we want to have is the government detailing what, let's take broadband, for example, or more accurately, internet providers. If the government is saying we want internet providers to cover the whole of the country, etc., the best way to do it is not to take back ownership of BT, or to take ownership of other companies, and and to sequester them, but rather to set the parameters under which they can operate. You have government control. You're operating in the same way that a hospital would operate. A hospital would bring in suppliers for different services, but they still say the standards and what they need to be produced. So I think that works in that case as well. Now, there are certain times when it won't. Now, I suppose you're familiar, gentle listener, with and Mark, with the idea of a natural monopoly. And when something is a natural monopoly, it means that the economy of scale of having just one company has overweighs the reduction in price and that would be by competition. So the economy of scale is just so great that it's naturally a monopoly. And in that case, you can argue that a state ownership, normal nationalisation, is good. And I would say something like water supply would fall into that. I
Exactly.
would say that's reasonable. So I say
can I
you judge it on a...
just to support that point.
Yeah, go ahead.
Because essentially what we're talking about is the difference between a service and commercialization. A service being the essential services that you need, where a government, for example, needs to think about its strategy long term, where infrastructure is crucial. So if you're building sewage plants, if you're building water plants, or any kind of long term infrastructure where you have to future-proof generations for a service which is so crucial, water being essential. I believe that governments, whilst I know that there have been some failings, but there have been more failings in recent times under privatisation. So I do agree that in the water area, that is definitely one which I would bring back in currently to the national.
Agreed. And even within that, you could still then bring in suppliers, who are private firms, and in that way you get competition. However, I think there is a big problem in all of this. As soon as you have the government running the show, whether they own it or not, there is the possibility of corruption, which is greater when you're talking about politics, because the politicians themselves are not wealthy. Not especially so they can be bought. And I see this.
I think what you mean here is that in the tender process, there are some shenanigans that could go wrong.
Well, yes, and let me just say that this is almost certainly happening with the train provision that you were talking about, and in the National Health Service.
We'll come on to the National Health.
But I'm just saying that this issue is one that is very difficult to get over. So what you try and have the idea of nationalisation only when that really is the best way to supply it, because this tendering for different parts of the nationalised industry, or being a supplier, is rife for abuse. But when it comes to you privatise it, it should be done on the free market. You shouldn't be having the government then deciding who gets it. It should be under published, open criteria, and people are just competing on a fair, flat playing field, effectively. And so, if that's done, then nationalisation, but sometimes being simply nationally controlled by the government, can work. But you've got to counter this problem of people effectively bribing the politicians who are putting the plan into effect.
Yes, and I think those mechanisms definitely need to be put in there. And I think this comes back to about transparency, because I think many people have been concerned in the past there hasn't been the transparency over tenders. But just to before we come on to the NHS, let's close out the railway service, because this unfortunately is an emotive subject, because it affects.
It is for you, because you travel on it regularly.
Well,
I don't.
Not only that, because it affects people in business,
but
it also affects people in society and social circles. And what I would say here is that, and I know that there are literally millions of people in this country who sadly have a very bad experience on the railway service. So when we look at privatisation versus nationalisation, where do we sit on this subject? Now, let's reveal my cards here. I believe that what we should be looking at is that the Labour Party, who have proposed this idea of nationalisation, sounds a little bit too daunting and more encompassing. To your point, that actually, if they run the service, we'll go back to the bad old days when the whole system was
that
just
is
an
the fear.
epic.
Yes. Yeah.
However, where I think the nationalisation programme can work, if Labour were to get power, is to bring it back under the government's control, but run it from a policy perspective, as you were saying, but still have the privatisation tendering, and effectively as an interim holder to reassess the way that the contracts work. At this moment in time, contracts with Southwest trains, so Southwestern trains as it is now, Southern Rail, and many, many others I know that there are people screaming at this podcast saying, but there are worse ones elsewhere around the country. All of them have to be renewed and retendered. I think the government is best placed to manage that process. And in the should we say, the short-term nationalisation programme, I think that would be the best way, because at the moment we've got big issues on the table here. Do you have guards? Do you not have guards on a train? Do you have the signalling as a separate service to the rail track, to the different aspects of the providers themselves? At the moment, the whole service is fragmented and incapable of providing the service to the customer.
Well, just a brief comment on that. What I would say is you do then need to go one way or the other. Either go for the nationalisation route, and as you say, getting people suppliers, or you go completely private and have certain criteria for a company to run it. But at the moment, what you've got is the track and the signalling, as you say, run by Network Rail, and then other companies, different companies in different parts of the country running things. But the other problem is, of course, the strength of the unions, and I think there's been a lot done to curb the strength of the unions. But what they will do is a union, supposedly a good thing because it is on the side of the worker and protecting their rights. But in practice, what often happens is that a union, what it is doing is protecting its own power base, and therefore retains jobs like guards, as you were saying, which are in fact surplus to requirements. And so they're making the companies they work for unprofitable. They'll end up all losing their jobs in the end. So I think something needs to be done about
my standpoint
the strength
on that
of unions.
one subject.
Yes, go
because
ahead.
as a user of the railway service,
yes.
And I know that many people have a difference of opinion here, but I do agree with the idea of having a guard on the train. Why? For the following reasons. Anyone who has used that service, who knows the system very well, will know that a train driver alone could not possibly do the following. Could not possibly understand what's happening within the train, despite the cameras in there, and having a guard who can answer questions, address issues both platform train to platform. It's impossible for the automated systems to cope with it and the driver alone.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's
from the point of view of health and safety, which is really where the standpoint is. I would reinforce the guards on the train.
Yeah, I mean that's a separate issue in that you're talking about it being genuine. Well, the issue that I was talking about was retaining jobs because the union says so. Which
I get that.
Yeah, which I guess there are both aspects to the retaining of guards, but of course the reason they want to get rid of them is they pay them too much.
Yeah.
Maybe there's a different way of recruiting.
The mother of all potential nationalisation.
Yes, let's
the
go for
NHS.
It's time. Yes. Let's talk about
folks,
it.
Before we get to Clergyman Pete's full view on this, this is the scenario.
Oh, it's coming. My full view's coming. Yes.
The National Health Service in Britain has often been seen as a flagship of the welfare state of health service. Not just in the United Kingdom, but of course as an example of how you run a health service. However, what has happened is that many people have been concerned about the way it has been run, the poor services, the waiting times, the lack of investment, the overpaid elite management, the underpaid people at the front end, the front line, but also the many other issues where there is a a dearth of nurses, doctors, and so on, whether it be in the United Kingdom or those who serve the United Kingdom from abroad. So the big potential is that what has been accused, well, certainly the Conservatives, rightly or wrongly, have been accused of, is that Donald Trump, and maybe this is not just him personally, but the idea that the Conservatives would sell down the river the NHS to American companies. Now, I think this is probably a massive exaggeration, but what we've got to debate here is what is best for the NHS going forward. Should it be under the government, i.e. nationalisation, or is it now time where perhaps we have a privatisation programme which brings in higher standards, makes it competitive, but at the same time is something that can now take it to the next level? Because at the moment, it's not working. Clergyman Pete, where do you stand on nationalisation versus privatisation with the NHS?
Well, the privatisation of the NHS was handled, I would say, in the worst possible way. What you have is hospitals competing with each other, and they in competing with each other, of course, you want to have the patients for yourself. You want to be able to treat them there, so you don't get the sharing of information necessarily that you would like in what is effectively, in terms of their research and development of their treatments, a scientific endeavour where you need to be able to have free share of ideas. But worse than that, if you're having people privatising in competition with each other, the best way for them to make a profit is to try and swallow up the competition. So you end up with the trusts, as they call local NHS trusts, bringing hospitals together and forming competing conglomerates of hospitals. And then within that, you get the competition for the particular tenders to supply certain services, and that is being routinely abused. I mean, I have no evidence, of course, of actual bribes being paid, and it may be it's far more complex than that. It may be sort of favours being given, and that's being given in return. But I've seen from people I know who work within the NHS, I've seen how this method of doing privatisation, which is so easily abused, because what you're saying is that that you're having privatisation occur, but that means that people can lobby the government for certain investment, for certain people being able to take on the building, for example, of these new hospitals that Boris Johnson is talking about. And in order to get that particular tender, there's two ways you can get it. Either you'll fulfil the requirements to the best standards and for the most reasonable price, or you're favoured by the politicians in power for whatever reason. Yeah. And so this has been done in the worst possible way. Should the NHS, I believe, should be privately delivered and publicly organised. But it can be done in a way that doesn't involve politicians handing out grace and favour. It could be done in a way, and I believe it should be done in a way, the NHS should be organised in a slimmed down way, which is open and transparent, with a far greater role for the actual medical staff in organising the how the hospitals are run for the sake of the patients. That's what I'd say. So I'm talking about a slimming down of the organisation and management, and having politicians at the head of the hierarchy.
Well, I agree with that. The NHS is one of the most emotive subjects that you could probably pick in the United Kingdom. Yeah. But I would also say that the National Service, of course, as we've seen in many other countries, such as the United States, i.e. how do you provide healthcare in a sustainable way? Yeah. This is pertinent to many countries, and of course, obviously, it's a big issue. But what I would say, if we take the NHS, I completely agree that if you were actually stepping back and redesigning the whole service, yes, you certainly wouldn't keep it to where it is. Right. And I think that it is this form of a hybrid, in the sense that what I think has learned from the lessons of the past, which is that politicians have used this as a political football for far too long. We've seen minister after minister, government after government coming in, tinkering with the service, but never really addressing the real issue. And the real issue is this. In the United Kingdom, as well as many other countries face this, people are living longer. People are demanding more from services, from drug companies and GPs and nurses, to the point where the scale of the operation is very different to the service that was offered 20, 30 years ago, which could have coped with the demands. Now, what that means is that what we've seen is, unfortunately, the service hasn't really been developed to meet the demands of today, but to future-proof the demands of tomorrow. And so what I would do is I would create a bold plan, almost going back to the principle of the future of the way that it was done originally, which was we didn't have an NHS service pre-Second World War. What we had was we had a designing of a system which I think now needs to come in place. And I would bring together what I would call a committee, an emergency committee comprising politicians and experts and health experts and economists and many others, and build an organization. We'll call it a body of some sort. Yes, folks, a body. Yes. And bring it there where it's going to run as an authority that sets the policy. Then we come on to the implementation. Hospitals will need investment. That will clearly come through the taxations and the services that from the national insurance, or NI as people would pay in there from their wages, as well as taxes. But unfortunately, this is something that doesn't sit well with a lot of people in the United Kingdom. But privatisation has to happen in the sense that many drug companies are now privatised. And by the nature of the way in which they feed into the NHS, you can't change that. And it means the competition is always going to be there. But I think that's a good thing in the sense that if we had a body which was now taking the government out of it, the process, who would then run it, be accountable and reported to the people. It had its own books, it had its own management structure, and I would say streamlined management structure, and the cost goes back into the frontline services. We would probably need to look at a program that would take 25 years. And I think that what needs to happen now is that I would see, if I was going into government, I would want to put into the next government, i.e. between 2020 to 2025, that proposal fully fledged, fully mapped out, ready to go, so that by the next election it could be implemented, because it's going to take that long. Now, this is where the privatisation versus nationalisation. I would actually say it's not nationalisation anymore. It's a new entity. It's this idea of creating a new bodily.
Well, you could say it's an organisation for the national benefit. It's not nationalised, it's for the national benefit.
It's not nationalised, which is very different to what we've been talking about.
These are old-fashioned terms, and we need to get away from them. I think you're right there.
We need a new term, effectively an authority that is independent, but will still be accountable to the people.
So any suggestions on a postcard to Boris Johnson at number 10? No, I think the important thing I wanted to just highlight here, for those who are still with us on this, listening, look, this is when Mark's talking about, it's going to take many years, 25 years to implement. This is something that's important to think about. We need to have long-term planning. That's what's been sorely lacking in our politics, and that's why, really, you can put down to that a lot of why we're in such a mess with things like the NHS, because there hasn't been proper long-term planning. I mean, you see also with the trains, the ridiculous decision to cut the train lines was a ridiculous idea, and that has left us with a poor infrastructure and a poor transport system, especially for heavy goods. But going back to the NHS, one thing that I don't know whether you'll agree with me on this, Mark, so let's just tease this out just briefly, finishing off on the NHS. The funding of it. You see, I'm of the opinion that the NHS is just going to keep swallowing up more and more money if you fund it through taxation, and national insurance, as it's run, is actually just an extra tax, isn't it? So it is taxation that's paying for it. What I would say is, I think there should be another way, that it shouldn't be funded through taxation. Well, you could have it, as we're trying to be nuanced, partially funded through taxation. I think there should be some sort of a net, a safety net, so that no one ever falls through the gaps. But most, I would try and aim for most medical care being funded privately. Now, through one system is through insurance. That's not the only way of doing it. You can have money put into your own private funds. So it's not insurance as such. It's just like your own health account. That is done in Singapore, by the way, and it's done. It's very effective, but it's partially very effective because they're such a small company. Based on they're such a small country. Based on a service and financial economy. And so that each person that tends to be pretty wealthy gets money from the government rather than the other way around. So maybe not their exact model, but a different model than simply taking money from the general taxation budget.
Yeah. So there is an argument from that, and I'll clarify it, which I think that the insurance element, which is the localization part, which meaning that the funds that often are taken from general taxes don't always, folks, go into the NHS.
No,
because essentially, really, it could go anywhere, and the government tells us that it's going into the NHS. But the bottom line is this, that whilst the government always publishes the figures of the money that's going there, I agree with this principle that you have a split. So where I would say that the taxation needs to fund things such as the emergency services, if you have an ambulance that's called out, if you have the call centres and so on. So those
you need
are the
100% cover.
That come from taxation. The localisation, if you had an insured, call it whatever you like, but if you had a policy where by law you had to put money into which is a form of tax, you had to put your money into that kind of health insurance, it would mean that wherever you went in the country, you would effectively transfer your local tax to that jurisdiction, to that council. That would mean that the money then is guaranteed to go to that service as opposed to being shifted to somewhere else. Look, I mean, the bottom line is it's a massive subject, folks. So listeners, what do you think? Do you have a particular view on nationalisation of certain services? Or maybe you're somebody who's really in favour of privatisation? Why not let us know? Log on to markandp.com and let us know your thoughts. Well, we'll be very interested to see what people vote for as the campaign builds up to the big election. Yes, it is coming. It's getting close. Remember that 12th of December.
Before Christmas.
So I'm sure that this particular subject is going to resonate with some of you. Well, join us again next time for more colourful conversations with Clergyman Pete and Businessman Mark.